welcome everyone here. My first thought was to remark that the design of this entire series was to reward the people who had the stamina to come to events about Iran again and again with a steadily more impressive product. And then I realized, since I would be the last speaker in a couple of weeks' time, this would be very self-serving. So I'm not going to introduce it this way. Instead, I'm simply going to say that this is a both professional and personal pleasure for me to welcome Asef Bayat here. He was 15 years ago. He spent about, he says, 6 months here. I seem to remember it being longer than that, but his memory is probably binding on this. While his wife was doing her doctorate at Teachers College. I happened to sit on the defense for that very good thesis. And I got to know Asef at that time, and at that time he was writing a book entitled Street Politics, which was an account of the Iranian Revolution more or less from below, dealing with the shantytown dwellers and the street vendors and so forth, the poorer elements in the Iranian Revolution. He then went off and taught for 15 years at the American University in Cairo, teaching sociology, and the product of those years was a book entitled Making Islam Democratic, Social Movements and a Post-Islamist Turn, which I strongly recommend. It's really an extraordinary book that compares the social developments under the Islamic Republic of Iran with what was happening at the same time in Egypt. And he makes a powerful argument there that Iran had an Islamic revolution but did not have an Islamic movement, whereas Egypt has had an Islamic movement but has not had an Islamic revolution. And I thought, okay, what he's going to talk about will probably be the come out of that, until I realized that he has 2 new books coming out. When he assumed the directorship of the International Institute for the Study of Islam in the Modern World in Leiden, it freed him from regular teaching assignments, and it is, of course, as many of you know, the premier place in the world for the broad and general survey of contemporary affairs in the Muslim world. And once he was freed from regular teaching, he has written 2 more books that are forthcoming. The Art of Presence, Changing the Contemporary Middle East, from Amsterdam University Press, anticipated for next year, and also The Making of Muslim Youths from Oxford University Press. So I don't know on which of these many projects he is going to draw for today's remarks, but he did say that the title, 30 Years of Islamic Revolution, should probably be amended to something like Iran, the Unfinished Revolution. So I want to present Asef Bayat.
Thank you, Rick. I really appreciate the invitation. And as I said, I'm not a stranger here. I was here some years ago. And I truly enjoyed being here during that 6 month, which in fact I started to write that Street Politics book. Now, what I want to talk about today, in fact, has nothing to do with any of those projects. Because when you asked me to do this lecture, I wasn't quite sure how to approach this 30 years of Islamic revolution. Because on the one hand, I didn't want to focus on a particular topic, particular issue. I had done it somewhere else. And also for my own selfish reason, I wanted to also reflect to sit back and reflect what happened in the last 30 years to this revolution, and what happened to the promise of the revolution. I think this is very crucial because of the fact that there is a strong sort of tendency in the sort of popular imagination, which perhaps has been reinforced by media or whatever, which considers the Islamic revolution, especially its aftermath, as something which stands counter to modernity, something which desires tradition and especially the reviving religiosity and so on and so forth. And maybe that's pretty natural because Islamic revolution spearheaded different types of movements that we see today around the world. But what I'd like to do is to say that the reality is really complicated. And I want to use my own memories and so on of revolution, post-revolution, and say that, yeah, it is much more complicated. And I want to show this by looking at the three components of the major slogan of the revolution. A slogan that revolution has been identified with. And looking at these three components or three demands and try to find out what happened to these in the past 3 decades. And perhaps conclude that the Iranian revolution is still unfolding and it is not yet finished. So the slogan was famously Istiqlal, Azadi, Jumhuriye Islami, independence, freedom, and Islamic Republic, which millions of people were chanting in the streets of the major cities, especially during the weeks which was closer to the collapse of the ancien regime. But it is in fact a marker of the Islamic revolution. Let me look at the first one, Istiqlal. I think the demand for Istiqlal, or for independence, reflected the mood of the day. In fact, the mood of the day among us at the time, in the 1970s, was that Iran, under the Shah, was a dependent country, a dependent nation. It was wabaste. After all, the Shah had been installed by the United States after a military coup, which later on led to 25 years of horrible dictatorship, and one which was identified by horrible secret police of Iraq. I don't go into detail, I'm sure you have talked about all this before. So at the time, we felt that the Shah was a US puppet, and the kind of sort of development and great civilization that he was really talking about was really unreal. It wasn't real. And this feeling of vabastagi or dependence was so strong that turned many of us into some kind of a romantic populist, in that we would say that modernization that was happening was not real. Or we were thinking that perhaps industry was not good, agriculture was good, or cities were bad, the villages, countryside is good. So there was a real, as I said, quest for Istiqlal, which was expressed in typical anti-imperialist and third worldist frame of the time, which was unfolding, of course, in Latin America, under independencia, and which galvanized, in the case of Iran, millions of people, whether religious or non-religious, men, women, nationalists or Marxists. I think the Islamic revolution did achieve this independence. In fact, it has been one of the most important achievements of the Iranian revolution has been its independence. But to my taste, actually, it is too independent. In fact, it is over-independent. I will tell you what I mean by this. Of course, there were other national and revolutionary movements which were trying to achieve independence in Southern Africa, in places like Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Angola, and so on. But in fact, they were unable to maintain their independence, that they had to deal with IMF and the World Bank and so on, because economically they couldn't manage. But Iran, however, what sustained its independence, has sustained its independence, of course, is its ability, somehow industrial ability, which at the time we didn't really accept, and the other one, of course, is the oil money. So, the Islamic Republic, I think, has survived, quite well. Economic sanctions after the revolution, it has survived horrible war with Iraq, and massive capital flight and brain drain. There is quite considerable corruption in the government, within the state, but I would say that Islamic State still is a developmentalist state. It has managed to deploy resources through construction crusade, through different kinds of foundations, of course different projects on road building, electrification, education, and so on, and basically have prevented an abject poverty in the country. But I think that Islamic regime has also somehow benefited from this independence. In other words, independence has been somehow functional to it. It has been functional because this notion, I think, isolates and secures the regime from the sort of aggressive competing ideas, models and lifestyles, that the full integration into the international community would unleash. And I think because Islamic regime is somehow peculiar in the sense that it is an ideological doctrinal regime, it has a narrow sort of basis of legitimacy on somehow exclusive sort of religious ideas. So therefore it is really apprehensive of losing hegemony at home. Whereas conservative Islamists are very apprehensive of these influences that they might receive from outside. But I think reformists, however, they feel that they can manage this. And the reason for that, I think they are self-confidently saying that we can manage it because we can offer what they call an alternative modernity. We can have our modernity, we can have our religiosity as well. I'll be talking about it a bit later. I think independence has been also functional to it because it has been turned into a sacrosanct, into a value that other politics or tendencies or ideas again are measured. So in other words, if, for instance, a conservative Islamists do not like a particular idea, they could easily say that it is Western. It is not Iranian, it is not Islamic, or it is American. And we have had a lot of them, like American freedom, American Islam, American intellectual, and so on and so forth. I suppose in a very similar way that you have here in this country with regard to security. The security, in a sense, a notion that overrides many other things, including civil liberties. Now, this sort of idea of independence in Iran reaches its height during the hostage crisis in 1981, and of course during the war, but it considerably changed during the Khatami's reform government in the late 1990s. But it has returned again under the current government because of this sort of conflict between Iran and especially the United States over the nuclear issue, energy issue. Now this over-independence, therefore, has been really in Iran at the cost of respecting freedom. Perhaps that was why, that was one reason why the revolutionaries were marching in the streets of big cities at the time. They were chanting not only independence, but also freedom, Azadi, as the major component of what revolution is to be about. I turn into Azadi. What did it mean then? Well, some people have suggested that it meant freedom from foreign domination. I don't think this is the case because people express that this vision through the first component, through the first element, that was istiqlal, or independence. I think my own recollection at the time is that the public sentiment in the 1970s regarded freedom in terms of really freedom from repression. It was a really repressive state, as far as I remember. Freedom to speak out, to organize, to write, to talk, and freedom from fear of secret police, so on, which, wrong or right, we consider that it is everywhere, in the classrooms, in the factories, in the farms, and so on and so forth. So I think this demand for freedom, I think, existed almost in all sectors of the society, whether it was in the villages, freedom from gendarmes, village police, or in the factories, or in the universities. But it became very significant among the intelligentsia especially. Now, a good degree of freedom, I think, was achieved as a result of the revolution. But in the first few months, in fact, that's why it was called the first few months Bahar Azadi, or Spring of Freedom. And we could actually feel, we could speak out, we could discuss in the street and organize and write and so on and so forth. Definitely, that was the best part of the entire experience. Obviously, more than anyone else, of course, the elites, the new political elites, felt very much free. But things began to change fairly rapidly with the ratification of the Constitution of the Islamic Republic, but especially with the hostage crisis and the invasion by Saddam Hussein against Iran. Things began to really deteriorate. And the regime became actually more, I would say, restrictive and even repressive. Public spaces became dominated by the revolutionary vigilantes, very male, and in fact they turned public spaces into their own sort of interior space in a sense. And so the youth, the religious minorities, and the women especially began to go through pretty bad social control, and after the Mujahideen Khalq began its campaign against the regime by some terroristic methods, bombing and so forth. And when Saddam Hussein's soldiers began to march in the southern cities, the regime became more repressive. So the 1980s was really a pretty dark decade. A decade that ironically, actually, the new state began to consolidate itself, and through a very strong populistic language and somehow repressive politics over a population which was really caught up, tried to get by and deal with the devastating consequences of the war. It was largely the 1990s, which was after the war with Iraq and under the President Rafsanjani. Again, the quest for freedom began to surge, began to emerge. And now, this reached its height under President Khatami, the reform government, who I think offered some platform for its expression through fairly free press, vibrant publication, organization, NGOs, and so forth. But now the kind of freedom that people, especially the young people, women, or intelligentsia, were really demanding was quite different from the type of freedom that their parents had demanded when they were marching during the revolution. Certainly, this new perception was very different from the version that conservative Islamists had in mind. As a matter of fact, the conservative Islamists were not really interested in the concept of freedom. They were interested before the revolution, but not really after. For most of them, in the 1980s and 90s, freedom basically meant hedonism, sexual freedom, westernization, and so on. And especially these things were the concept of freedom was being echoed by liberals, by Democrats, by women, by young people, basically by opposition. So they were very interested in the concept of freedom. Some intellectual sort of Islamists, like Ayatollah Khamenei, who is the spiritual leader, he says that Islam does have the concept of freedom, but it is some kind of spiritual freedom, and freedom from, he says, slavery, freedom to fulfill obligations, to do grand work, to reach the height of spirituality. Otherwise, the mundane kind of freedom basically are restricted by the political and moral sort of boundaries of the Islamic State, which really means that people are free to the extent that conservative Islamists say they are. Now, but for the new generation, for the new generation of students or the young people or women in the late 1990s or early 2000s, the concept of freedom basically had to do with individual freedom, individual liberties. In fact, no time probably in Iranian history this issue has become so significant as it is today, individual freedom. It became the key discursive really component of student movement and youth movement, women's movement, and the new intelligentsia, so that actually it distinguished the earlier movements from the current ones. Youth, for instance, they want to be young, they want to express and experience usefulness, where to go, what to wear, what to think, who to marry, who to not marry, or women freed from sort of constant surveillance and chaperoning of their male or state laws. They want to have choice of partner, jobs, hobbies, and whatever other women in the world actually desire to have. In fact, one, I think, troubling consequence of all this is this phenomenon of runaway girls. Probably some of you know that there are thousands of girls who actually escape from homes, and because, in fact, in research, some good research has been done on them, that one major component of their reason as to why they're doing it, because they are seeking freedom, getting out of the surveillance of their parents and so on. Now, the thing is that society in general has been actually moving towards more and more individuation. There's a desire to sort of seek autonomy. So there's actually more and more nuclear family we are having. In fact, any family, the model of family definitely is nuclear family, and very few children. In fact, 2 is the model now, becoming a model now. There's more emphasis on raising children rather than having, in fact, more. There's more emphasis on individual competence of the young people as opposed to ageism. Actually, ageism is withering away. Even this I have observed in the villages. So the young people are becoming, they're getting legitimacy as opposed to older people only based upon their competence, their ability. I think this is very important and shows, in fact, how the Iranian society is becoming more modern. Women, of course, are increasingly seeking autonomy in decision-making at home, in matters of divorce, children, or pursuit of social roles. These are partly, I think, a result of structural processes in Iranian society, including the rise in the considerable rise in literacy, on education, on urbanization, and mobility and visibility. But this individuation seems to be also mixed with a sort of troubling trend towards more really selfishness and a kind of a cutthroat, in a sense, self-centeredness. In Iran, they say, that everybody wants to try to actually serve himself or herself when the resources are really limited. In fact, a lot of them feel that they are instead cheated by their solidarizing during the revolution and helping each other and so on to create a new society. But they feel now that they are being cheated. They should have actually served themselves. So therefore, the main focus is actually themselves. And these are shown by very good surveys that the Ministry of Irshad, the National Guidance, has produced. Very, very good studies. In fact, these trends are shown, for instance, that trust is becoming, unfortunately, less among the people. So as a result of this undermining of trust between people, there is a real concern on the part of thinkers in Iran that perhaps society might be moving towards what they call furupashi ijtimai, social collapse. The society that might not be able to regulate itself and to integrate. Of course, religion has been usually a factor for social integration and moral regulation and a kind of a glue to put society together. And those social thinkers are thinking that religion in Iran has been very much mixed with politics, and people, because of that, because it has been so much politicized, that people actually are moving away from their Islam. But the fact of the matter is that this is not true. In fact, although there is a strong anti-clericalism in Iran, but people have not turned away from their religion. They are still believers. But their religion is minimalist. Dina haddaqali. Basically, they still hold strong religious feelings about God, and even less actually inclined towards ritual. And in belief, for instance, there is a trend towards more mystic and Sufi type individual piety. And in rituals, there are more now innovations. For instance, in recitations and ritual during Muharram and Ashura, there are now new innovation, like rap-like sort of rhythmic sort of recitations have been introduced that try to modernize those traditional rituals. In politics, in fact, they are actually moving away from Islamism towards what I call post-Islamism. That means that they don't want to see necessarily religion being in fact used by politics, because it is neither good for politics nor for religion. In fact, the most sort of perhaps debated theme with respect to freedom, azadi, has been, of course, the position of women in Iran, and there's so much been talked about and written, especially in this part of the world. But I think, again, reality is very complicated. It is much more than a mere sort of picture of women being totally subjugated in the Iranian society. It is more complex than that. Certainly, women in general, but especially modern middle class women, have faced additional restrictions under the Islamic Republic. There has been forced bathing, nobody can deny it. In some places there is gender segregation. There is widespread surveillance and clear inequality before law, especially in terms of the person's status law. And yet, women are by far more educated under the Islamic Republic, both general literacy and especially in higher education. There are more women novelists and filmmakers, and they are much more active, publicly active, and much more visible. Especially, in addition to that, a big sector of the traditional women who under the Shah would be secluded and would remain at home because their male, their fathers or brothers wouldn't allow them to go out because the society was unsafe. Now they feel that society is safe, so they allow them to actually be publicly active, to seek education and literacy. And that has really contributed quite considerably to the women's constituency in terms of their both visibility and their public activity. Women are much more now self-conscious about themselves as women. That's very important. They are more assertive especially of their individuality. There is a really women activism inside the country when you are comparing it with the neighboring countries, for instance. In fact, some people have considered that women perhaps are the most important, in a sense, constituency which stands against the authoritarianism of the Islamic regime. Now, the statuses of independence and freedom, which I have so far outlined, have been an outcome of the third component of the revolution, and that is the Jumhuriya Islami, or Islamic Republic. What is it? Well, its current form is social and political order where the central legitimacy lies in divine ordained values, or as the Shaya Ilahi, or Islamic principles. The central to Islamic Republic is the Islamic State, which is based upon the concept of Walayat al-Faqih, or supreme rule of jurists, who in effect is in a position to say what those divinely ordained values or Islamic principles are. So the faqih, or supreme ruler, is to rule the ummah so long as the 12th imam in Shia belief remains in occultation. But there is also room for people, for popular sovereignty, for parliament. It is the people themselves who actually make laws. But both the parliamentarians and their laws need to be approved by a small group of clerics and lawyers who are effectively sanctioned by the Supreme Faqih. So therefore there is a kind of a closed circuit of power and patronage and support which somehow reproduces the power of the a clique, a clerical clique, a conservative clique. But of course right now it is conservative, but it doesn't have to be in the future. Is this what the millions of revolutionaries had in mind when they were marching and chanting Istiqlal Azadi Jumhuriya Islami 30 years ago? Probably unlikely. In fact, the term Jumhuriya Islami, Islamic Republic, in the demonstration appeared for the first time about 6 months before the regime change, before the collapse of the Ancien regime, on the 7th of September 1978. And about 1 year and a half after the protests actually had started. What it meant at the time was certainly that the people didn't want the monarchy, they didn't want Shah because they wanted republic. And also it seems that they wanted some kind of democratic governance. But the adjective Islamic in the Islamic Republic was very unclear. Because it had there was no precedence of the Islamic Republic. Probably people imagined it as a republic which is just, is a pious republic, just republic, and democratic, which has been inspired by Islamic justice. This is what I feel, and this is what, for instance, Bazargan, who was close, of course, aide of Ayatollah Khomeini, also what he feels at the time. Even after the revolution, when people still were voting for the referendum for Islamic Republic as opposed to the monarchy, still the actual meaning of the term Islamic Republic was not clear. My imagination is that, in fact, they have this imagination that I outlined when they were voting. But the actual details of the Islamic Republic, the way that we know today, was revealed only when the final draft of the Constitution was drafted on the 3rd of December 1979, some 10 months after the so-called revolution, after the regime change. And this, of course, happened after a really intensive struggle. When Ayatollah Khomeini was in Paris just before the revolution, or during the demonstrations and so on, he asked one of his aides, called Mr. Hassan Habibi, to prepare a constitution, and he did. And this constitution was very much inspired by French constitution, as it was pretty secular, except that there was one clause which referred to Shura Nigahban, or the Council of Guardians, composed of 5 clerics and 6 lawyers. But there was no words or nothing about the rule of clerics, nothing about the right of faqih. Ayatollah Khomeini was supposed to go back to Qom and to Nazarat, to basically supervise things. And this draft, actually, of constitution was accepted by the provisional government and by Ayatollah Khomeini himself. But when this draft went to Shura-e-Inqilab, or Revolutionary Council, and especially IRP, Islamic Republican Party, which had just been established and had been dominated by clerical Islamists, it was somehow emasculated, changed into the current form and current version, and then it was sent not to Constituent Assembly, which had been sort of thought to be sent, but actually was sent to Majlis al-Khobregan, or Assembly of Experts, which the members had 90% of members were actually clerics. So as I said, all these things were achieved as a result of intense struggle which was going on at the time. You see, I think ambiguity and generality is the hallmark of almost any revolution. I mean, revolution, the slogan must be ambiguous, must be general, because it ensures unity. People don't discuss what is the meaning of it. There's no time, especially in the case of Iran also. But when things become clear, so clarity actually creates, of course, different positions and differences and discussions and dissent and even struggle. And this happened just after the Shah really had gone, when it became clear what the meaning of what different people had thought, had imagined about what Islamic Republic was. Of course, intense struggle began to emerge. And I think a lot of Islamists at the time were afraid that they might not be able to ratify the constitution, so they began a massive mobilization of the grassroots. They went around and the villages and so on, they asked for the entire land reform. They announced that there will be home for everyone. In fact, I was at the time in Tehran, and the villagers had come to Iran and they camped in the Maidan Shariat Azadi in order to get their homes. And they called for nationalization of foreign trade, and nationalization of industry, and a lot of anti-US rhetorics, and so on and so forth. So that the people like the liberals and Democrats and even some leftists, they were actually considered to be pro-America, pro-West, and pro-capitalist, and therefore counter-revolutionary. In this way, actually, the Constitution was ratified, and of course, it ensured the power of a new sort of religious oligarchy. But is the Islamic Republic, Islamic state in the form that we have today, is really totalitarian? I don't think so, at least not yet, because Islam, as is known, does not have a particular church with unified authority. There are always disagreements in opinions on the fatwas. For instance, the law of Islat Arsi, or land reform, is it Islamic or it isn't? There was no agreement for years, and in the Majlis, in the Parliament, until it was ratified, and basically as a result of political pressure. So in Shiism, of course, there are different maraja, and people follow their own marja. In addition, so there has been also constant pressure and resistance from below which makes it very difficult for the Islamic State totally to go towards totalitarianism. But there has always been, from the very, I think, beginning of post-revolution years, this notion of insiders, outsiders, khodi or ghayr khodi. And but the insiders, of course, is even if they are disagreements, but it is at least part of us. But this part of us, this khodi, these insiders, the boundaries are shifting. And in fact, they are becoming smaller and smaller. Is the system archaic and pre-modern? Well, the doctrinal regime certainly stresses on sort of traditional values, institutions, and sources of legitimacy. Of course, divine is the source of legitimacy. There's a strong emphasis on obligation and much less on rights. And of course, there is a concept of haqq, but haqq as opposed to batil rather than as opposed to taklif or obligations. So there is more emphasis on obligation rather than rights. There's not much really concept, as I said, of freedom. There's more emphasis on selflessness and or community. But in many ways, the Islamic Republic is a modern, really, product. Bayat al-Faqih itself is, of course, a modern invention. Even the introduction of the Bayat al-Faqih, or the supreme, the absolute rule of the jurist, Ayat al-Khumani, add the absolute in it, in fact, had the intention of maintaining a unified state laws against the chaos of the plurality of different fatwas and different judges who would actually give different opinions for a single case, for instance. So it was, in a sense, wanted to maintain the strength of the state as opposed to the fragmentation of authority. It was a centralized, in a sense, state. And of course, this was at the cost of the increasing power of the supreme jurist, or the faqih. The regime, in fact, Islamic regime rules through, after all, a very modern state. Modern state with its own rational and bureaucratic exigencies. You have ministries, you have a central bank, and so on and so forth. In fact, one of the interesting conflicts that Iran has had, the conflict between the state and the regime. And of course, the governance, in addition, contains this, as I said, a semi-democratic structure. You have parliament, you have city councils, they are all elected directly by people. Even Rahbar himself is in fact elected by an assembly of experts, which that assembly is directly elected by people. But again, those restrictions that I mentioned before also persist. Now, interesting things about Islamic Republic is that under Islamic Republic, religious institutions have become really very much modernized. And Hosea, or the seminary, has been very much modernized, well, precisely because the clerics who have been ruling, they have got to answer to modern questions on the issues of the economy, on society, and so on and so forth. So therefore, the clerics who study in places like Qom are no longer really self-sufficient in terms of the sources that they read. It's no longer traditional sources, and also they read philosophy, they read Popper and Western philosophers, and so on and so forth. There is more, in fact, emphasis on al-Gharai, or rationalism, as opposed to scripturalism. In fact, jurisprudence is no longer, well, it is still important, but it's losing its significance as opposed to emphasis on philosophy and theology. And this actually distinguishes sort of religious thought in Iran from, for instance, say, Azhar, which I think still remains pretty traditional. In fact, religion itself has become pretty modernized. It's become very self-reflexive and self-critical. Under Islamic State, society itself has become quite in fact modernized, more modern in fact. Because literacy has increased dramatically, and as I said, that also includes women, especially rural women. Iran has become more urban. In fact, there's a creeping urbanity into villages, and I'm from village myself, and go and visit the tremendous actually changes which are happening there. In the villages you have a nursery. That's very important to have a nursery, and so women become, of course, more free to do things for themselves. That was unheard of during my time. And as I mentioned, women themselves, including the traditional segment of women, have become more mobile, more vocal, and more visible. So therefore, there is a civil society. There is a formal, informal institutions and movements. There's a real public sphere that debate actually takes place. So Iran is not really a closed society, but a connectivity with the outside world has been really maintained. For instance, there are, as everybody knows, currently 11 million internet users, 100,000 bloggers, weblogs, sorry, which is apparently number 3 in the world after the United States and China. So these, I think, have resulted partly from the inescapable process of globalization, but I think more importantly, it is the outcome of the developmentalist nature of the Islamic State itself. That is, like rural development, electrification, and education, and so on. But the Islamic State remains authoritarian, limiting the participation of the vast majority of people in the decision-making on important matters. It has maintained strong social control and moral discipline. In short, it has really curtailed the republican aspect of the Islamic Republic. So when we go back again, consider Istiqlal Azadi Jumhuriyet Islami, which was a hallmark of the revolution, what we have is, therefore, really an unfinished revolution. Its democratic thrust is still missing. The reform movement, which partially sort of transformed into becoming a reform government, in fact came to rectify this republican deficit, to democratize, in a sense, the Islamic Republic. And it's no accident, therefore, that when Khatami was elected and a new era began, they called in Iran the second revolution. So, and the novelty of this new experiment, of course, was that people thought that a fundamental change can happen, but it can happen in a peaceful fashion, without going through another revolution, in a sense, violence. So millions of Iranians, some 70% of the total voters, in fact the turnout at the time was 80%, voted for Khatami, who was pretty unknown at the time, against a very known cleric, on the promise of islahat, or reforms. That is, to establish the rule of law, and meritocracy, or Shaya Salari, tolerance as opposed to violence, civil society, and of course, democracy. Now, I think that at the beginning of the revolution, when you were talking about the reform, of course, it was a bad word, and it was like a betrayal, whereas inqilab, or revolution, was the real word. But things have, of course, changed dramatically. Now, of course, the reform strategy, I'm going to finish now, was to empower the society from below and negotiate and to enhance democratic governance at the top through legal channel. And to some extent, it did empower the civil society by providing opportunity for free press, growth of NGOs, political parties, various kinds of social movements, and of course widespread debates and so forth. Now, of course, reform movement itself was only one aspect of a larger movement which began to unfold since the early 1990s, which are called post-Islamist movement. It aimed at transcending Islamism as a political project. That is, the religious state, to transcend the religious state, moral control, social control of gender, and transcend ideologizing religion and in the service of politics. It wanted to create a secular democratic state, but in the context of a religious society. It also wanted to create or establish or hegemonize religious pluralism, both within a particular religion and also between different religions. In short, it wanted to fulfill the Republican promise of the revolution. But by and large, it has failed. I can't go into detail, I don't have time, but by and large, it has. I don't think it has totally failed, but to a large extent, it has. And now, of course, there is a government under President Ahmadinejad that is seems that desperately trying to revive the revolutionism of the early 1980s and trying to build new sources of legitimacy, an alternative, in a sense, to reform. Even though he borrows a lot from, in fact, the ideas of reform, very much. But, of course, Iran today, under President Ahmadinejad, is very different from Iran of the 1980s. And I think that this is a major anomaly for the current governments. And thank you very much for your patience.
The floor is open to discussion.
I have two questions.
Please speak fairly loudly. Acoustics back there.
In Iran, we have 9 million people who are living under poverty line. And you mentioned that the revolution was relatively started to economic growth or something like that you mentioned. And the second measure is there are many things I can say in the presentation. But the second thing was very important that you mentioned that the Iranian regime is not totally serving. My question to you is they almost destroyed one generation of very young people in the early 80s where when they were killing almost 50,000 young prisoners in a period of time of 6 months, and the war didn't tell anything. How can you say that the regime has any kind of legitimacy?
The question has to do first with the question of 9 million people living in poverty. Second, questioning the issue of totalitarianism. How can you say a regime has legitimacy when in the early 80s a generation of people were wiped out in the context of presumably the struggle with the Mujahideen al-Khalq
And other groups, not only
and other groups.
No, there is poverty. And what I said, I was actually being careful. I said that it has actually managed to avert abject poverty. When you are actually comparing with, in fact, we have lowered down the standards, I'm afraid, because the situation is so bad around the region and so on, that comparatively, actually, despite the fact that they do not have actually very much legitimacy, I'll come back to that later, they have managed through various institutions like different Bunyad Imam, and so on, to prevent from major crises. Things actually could have gone much worse as a result of mismanagement and a horrible, of course, 8-year war. Yeah, I agree with you that, of course, at certain stages in the 1980s, I said in the 1980s was a dark decade. It went through, there was a lot of killing, and they accepted it, a lot of executions. I was part of it, I was there, it's horrible. But it is different when you're saying that it is totalitarian, meaning that you can actually do not speak out, there isn't much agreement. And they have managed to actually totally homogenize the ruling elite, homogenize the society. But it isn't like this. There is opposition. I think there is opposition, especially of course from below. And also there is disagreement also at the top. So that there are a lot of holes, and that's one of the major, I think, for people who want to bring about some change, is that there are those holes that can be filled. I mean, if you go to the different ministries, there are interesting institutions actually are created that try to bring about some change within the state itself. It's very important, I think, to see this. So I often call it totalitarian. It is authoritarian, definitely. That prevents the participation of the vast majority of people in decision making. But it doesn't mean that people do not really speak out. As otherwise, how we can talk about the existence of movements, women's movement, youth movement? That means that there is a movement that they operate and they resist and I think the current regime is very much, I think, afraid of, for instance, women's activities. No wonder they are arresting the major leaders of this, for instance, campaign for 1 million signature. So it is, I think, more complex than this.
Right here.
In your first and maybe somewhat your second book, you have this whole thing about workers' control of the economy. If I'm not mistaken, you were a participant in that. And there's some books that have come out recently. I don't know if you know Andres Malm's about the workers' protests in Iran going on now. I'm curious, in terms of your frame of these three themes of the Islamic Republic, freedom and independence, how would you compare the nature of workers' protests at the time, right before, and this 2-3 year fierce battles that you talk about in your first couple books, late 70s and the early 80s, that period compared to what's going on now with workers' protests?
Very different, very good question. Very different, very different. I think almost everything was different at the time. Well, that was time of playing a role. I mean, everybody wants to play a role. I'm saying in that book, I mean, anybody who had an institution, they wanted to have self-determination. Forget. You want to determine and run the institution by yourself in the factories, in the farms, in the schools, universities, and even segments of the army that the soldiers actually, cadets, wanted to run and elect the army. That was a time, of course, of incredible revolutionary romanticism. That's the time Shah is gone. And I think that is not unusual. It happens in other major revolutions. So the main sort of constraint has gone, and that's a time for us to play a role. And that is the meaning, in a sense, of revolution. So there was a massive mobilization in almost every sector of the population. And that included even the unemployed. I mean, what do the unemployed do? What kind of institutions they have? I remember unemployed would go and do the traffic, they run the traffic and manage the traffic to play a role. So the nature of that kind of struggle by the workers, yes, that was my first book, in the factories was quite different. Over there, they wanted to establish some degree of self-management in the industry. We've seen it in Algeria, in Chile, in other countries as well. But of course that ended after about 3 years, because a lot of them actually realized that they couldn't run, because control requires competence. You have to know how to run. And when you don't have the competence, then production stops, and you can't produce your wage. So therefore, they had to ask the Prime Minister at the time to actually send them professional managers to run. So that was against the very ideal of self-management. But in today's, however, struggle by the bus driver, it is now a trend towards really real trade unionism. At the time, we didn't have a trade union. It was a factory-based councils. But now it is a very quite new era. Try to create a trade unionism of the bus drivers of the entire, for instance, city of Tehran. Not only create an institution, but also through the creation of the institution to fight against, for instance, delay in their wages. And that's a major thing, that you work and you don't get your wage. And there's a big delay, and that was one of the major sort of demands of the workers.
I'm not saying my question is, how do you see the future of the Islamic Republic? Can they fulfill those promises as well as can they achieve those slogans?
The question is the future of the Islamic Republic.
That's, of course, difficult question for me.
About 30 seconds.
Yes. I think that regime still is very stable. It's quite stable. There are a lot of tensions. There are a lot of contradictions, a lot of messiness. But these contradictions and tensions do not mean impossibility. You can actually go on for decades and decades with these tensions, contradictions, conflicts, and so on. But I have personally maybe a sort of romantic notion of, in the case of Iran, people resisting. And I have observed it for the last 20 years or so. And I think there are ways in which people are trying to bring about positive changes and moving the regime towards more, I would say, democratic direction. Even if people say that the reform movement has failed, I still want to say that we shouldn't say it has totally failed. Reform government definitely failed to fulfill a major objective that it has, to break into that circle of patronage and power that I mentioned, to break into it. And through those sort of double bills, which Khatami introduced, to restrict, for instance, the power of the Shura Nigahan or the Council of Guardians. And they are the major obstacle. But of course that was a failure. But I think there are spaces, there are holes. Actually, I'm going to tomorrow talk about these holes in your school. Sorry?
You are going to answer the question, or we should continue?
No, actually, I want to. Yeah, well, yes, I try with some kind of a model through what are called non-movements. There are all these non-movements which is going on. They are not totally organized social movements and so on, but there is so much going on in the society. It is a collective action of non-collective actors, of women, of the young people, and so on and so forth, which are pretty active. I'm not answering right now because I'm going to do it tomorrow.
Yes, I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit more about these runaway women. What segments of society they come from, and what happens to them when they run away?
There are, well,
Could you repeat the question?
a lot of them, of course, are urban middle classes.
But the question is about the runaway girls and what happens to them.
Yes. And urban, largely middle classes, who some of them are even globalizing urban youth, girls, and what happens to them is, by and large, bad, very terrible. In fact, some of them end in prostitution and so on. But a lot of them actually do end up in shelters. There are numerous shelters which have been built, and they go there and stay there. Of course, there is a struggle between shelter runners and the state because of the fact that forcing the shelter runners to give back the kids to their families and so on. But shelter runners do not wish to do it. They want to keep them away for some time, go through the degree of education and so forth, and then through their consent to go back to the family. There are a couple of actually good also, I think both studies and videos in fact exist on this.
Yes, okay.
You've not specifically mentioned education, and I wonder how education plays a role in the sense of both the Islamic view and a sense of nationalism within a region, or, what is the education thrust, or is it universal?
Universal education? Yes.
I mean, the education, somebody goes to school in Iran, what are they learning? And how much of it has to do with propaganda or not propaganda, or,
Yeah, of course, especially primary education or pre-university education. The theory of education is that they try to reproduce, the system. Of course, there's a lot of ideological issues in the textbooks and so forth. But the question is to what extent they are taken seriously. There is also resistance within education itself, in the classrooms and so forth. But I think what I was trying to refer to is that a vast majority of people are now literate. It's a literate society. It's very important. It's a literate society. That includes, again, especially women, especially rural women. And to me it's important that a rural woman who's married, and I know a person from my village, who actually goes to university. And her child is taken care of by her husband. And these are important. These are very important. Or the women who actually go to universities, because education is very much valued in Iran, probably many places in the world. And it's important for them to attend, not necessarily learn proficiency, but the very presence of them in the education environment is very important. So when they do go to university, then they live alone. They live alone, without chaperoning and so on and so forth. And they very much enjoy this. So this is a new experience for a lot of young girls, for instance, not to mention of boys as well. These are the kind of changes that are, of course, being developed. So both in terms of higher literacy, is now over 80% of, and also higher education, which again famously everybody knows that girls or women have taken over university in terms of their number than the men. And that has created an anxiety, in fact. Anxiety. It's interesting, I think, anxiety in the sense that, okay, these women graduate from the universities, and who are they going to get married? They would either marry a person with similar education or higher. Yeah? So if you have actually men who are actually lower education, so there would be a crisis, they would argue, and so on. So this is at least a reason why they want to, in fact, they adjust and they put a quota.
Question over here.
Hi, can you address what the role was of religious minorities in the years leading up to the Islamic Revolution? For example, for Baha'is or Zoroastrians or Christians or Jews, what role did they have in bringing down the Shah?
Well, as far as I remember, it was a national revolution, and I've had a number of actually Christian friends who were definitely marching in the streets. And post-revolution, they joined, of course, the opposition groups largely as leftists and as liberals and so on. Of course, they considered themselves as a member of this society, Iranian society, and they also did not like particularly the Shah. But of course, things changed when the Shah is gone and you have a religious state, which of course creates a lot of problem for people who are religious minority. But of course now they are free, of course, to practice their religion and so on. But there are at the same time restrictions. For instance, women, the Christian woman is supposed to wear a hijab. So of course they are not happy about this.
But it seemed like just before the Islamic Revolution broke out, the very leftist and liberal organizations sort of fell under the rubric of the more conservative Islamic organizations. So, even then, is it true that Jews and Christians, they still stayed with those organizations even if they were supporting conservative Islam ideologies?
Well, at the time, as I said, at the time, this was not in the card. As I said, nobody knew what Islamic Republic was. It was the idea that we are struggling to get rid of the dictatorial regime of the Shah and create a new republic. But the meaning of what Islamic Republic was not clear. Nobody knew. So therefore, and that's what I'm talking about, the vagueness, the ambiguity. Also that included them too, to create unity, to topple the regime, but things became clear just after the Shah was gone.
Yes.
What, if anything, could the Iranian government do that might possibly contribute to a relaxation of tension, with the United States, without, a sacrifice of their rights of sovereignty?
I think probably I'm going to discuss this issue here. What I would suggest that I think both sides should sit down and negotiate and talk.
I wonder what the situation of ethnic minorities is in Iran, particularly Kurds. The situation in Turkey obviously has gotten a lot of attention. And there's also mention of a branch of the PKK, remember the initials, which functions in Iran, which I understand our government is very sarcastic, which our government has been apparently aiding people to destabilize the Iranian government. Is the Kurd situation at all comparable to that in Turkey, and are other ethnic minorities free to practice their culture?
The question is about ethnic minorities and the Kurds in particular.
Yes. Of course, the struggle for autonomy was a major sort of component of the kind of struggles I was talking about at the beginning, just in a few months after the revolution. They also rose up and they wanted autonomy and so on. And in fact, especially in Kurdistan and in Azerbaijan, in the north. And that was partially, I think, was encouraged by a number of sort of leftist organizations who at least you saw not only a value in the autonomy, they were not for cessation, but for autonomy. But also they saw that place, Kurdistan, as a place where actually they could seek refuge in a way that in fact Kurdistan and Iraq has become a place where the Iraqis actually go there. And so those struggles were taking place. But the ethnic minorities like Kurds being used by foreign forces and so on, I think historically it's been the case. I think both sides, both the Iraqis under the Shah were using the Iranian Kurds and the Shah were using the Iraqi Kurds to destabilize the other.
Yes.
Thank you. I want to ask about your views about the recent debates on militarization of Iranian politics. As a sociology professor, what do you see? Does Iran going towards militarization?
I think that has derived
The question is about recent ideas about militarization of Iranian politics.
I think this has, derived from the fact that the present president is pretty close to the ranks of revolutionary guards and especially intelligence. So therefore, it is suggested that Iran is moving towards militarization. I'm not really sure. I'm not sure to what extent this is a real trend, because there is also opposition, really, a concern on the part of the so-called traditional Usul Gerayan, that they don't want necessarily to see a government run by the military wing. They want to run the thing themselves, but not necessarily the military. So it is perhaps it's too early to say whether it is a real tendency towards militarization.
Salam. I have two questions actually. First, I wanted to know one thing that really, to me, seems as a complete front to a democratic process is this Guardian Council, which vets the candidates and doesn't allow all candidates to run. Particularly in this last election, there was a number of candidates who were not permitted to run. I don't understand, it's completely beyond my comprehension how they can justify, the government can justify legitimacy and saying that they are a republic and still continue with this process. I just kind of wanted to know, what is their justification for this? And my second question relates to what she was asking about the women, and you said that there are a number of female, or a majority of women coming from universities, and who do they marry in this dilemma? But also, what about the situation for them post-graduation? Are there equal opportunities in employment as there are for even uneducated men? From what I've heard, there's not, but I wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes. What was the first question? Yeah. Oh, yeah, how they can justify. Well, it is constitutional. It is in the Constitution. Their argument is that if you accept that you are living in Islamic State, so the laws are supposed to be sanctioned and by experts to make the man-made laws to accord with the Islamic principles and so on. Who does it? The Council of Guardian does. Who is selected? Who elects them or who sanctions them? By and large, it is the Supreme Faqih, who is the highest authority in the country. So if you accept the Nizam, they keep talking about Nizam, the system, then this is the rationale within the system. But if you are critical of this, of course, it becomes, the system has become, as I said, like security here. It's sacrosanct, we can't criticize it and so on. Of course, some do. Some have called for the change in the constitution. In fact, during the Khatami era, a big number of the MPs, members of parliament, wanted to change the constitution. But there is such an uproar on the part of the conservatives that even they don't want this to be discussed in the parliament. As to, yes, I think that it is an issue, of course. It isn't the issue of what happens to the girls and, for other matters, guys who graduate from the university. I think it is a basically universal question. What do you do with your education? Whether education is something that gives you proficiency for you, or necessarily, it is not necessarily. In some way, as we were discussing this actually before this lecture, with one of your colleagues, my experience is that by and large, to some extent, I think education plays a role of creating a status. It's very important for people to go to university. Of course, for men, it does matter. For all men, it does matter what happens when they graduate, because the idea is that they are the breadwinners. And for women, education is important, because that is a major sort of venue through which they can assert themselves. They could be publicly active. They can actually socialize. And actually, as an institution in which, in fact, they can find their marriage partners, for instance. These are important. If they want to assert their individuality and choose their own partner rather than waiting their parents to create an arranged marriage. So universities and education institutions play that very important part. But as to what happens after, my answer is that this is the case, an issue for both men and women, whether in fact they are able to find jobs in accordance with what they have studied. Given the current situation, probably a lot of them really don't. Depending upon, of course, what kind of education you have. If you are a medical doctor or engineer, you probably have. But if you are doing perhaps, I don't know, psychology or social sciences, you might not.
I think one last question here in the corner.
First of all, thank you very much for your time and your insights. I was curious about the impact of Shirin Ebadi's having won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2003. And
can you repeat again?
I was just curious to know about the impact of Shirin Ebadi's having won the 2003 Nobel Peace Prize in Iran, and particularly its impact on civil society discourse and the women's rights and human rights movement. Has it been a source of rising all tides in a way, and raising all boats?
The question is about the Nobel Prize winner Shirin Ebadi and whether her naming to that prestigious award has had an impact upon rights and women, etc.
Yes, I think it did have. I mean, I had a conversation with one of the leaders of women's movement in Iran, who is now in the United States. And in fact, she particularly was mentioning that when Shirin Ebadi won that prize, it created a new kind of energy, incredible energy among women, precisely because they felt that they are being recognized. They are being recognized, and people actually see what they are actually, what they are doing. And in fact, I invited her to come to Leiden and speak, so I had a conversation with her, and she constantly was saying what you can do abroad is that make actually people who are struggling inside the country feel that they are being recognized, that they are not left alone and nobody notices them and so on. So such prizes actually are significant, and it did have some impact definitely on the women's movement.
Please join me in thanking Professor Asef.